In the early years of the Second World War, for millions of Germans, their only window into the United States was through a heavily distorted lens, the lens of Nazi propaganda. Joseph Goebbels' meticulously crafted narratives painted a picture of America as a nation on the brink of collapse, a melting pot of racially impure elements plagued by rampant crime, industrial inefficiency, and a hedonistic culture that lacked the discipline and racial purity of the Third Reich. Newsreels showed a caricatured Uncle Sam as a bumbling, oversized capitalist, his military depicted as laughably amateurish, lacking the iron will and technological superiority of the Wehrmacht. Soldiers marching off to war were fed this diet of contempt, told they were fighting a soft, weak enemy that would crumble at the first serious blow. They truly believed that American industry was incapable of mass production, that its diverse population was a source of weakness, and that their ultimate victory was a foregone conclusion. This carefully constructed illusion was not just for public consumption, it deeply shaped the mindset of the average German soldier, filling them with a dangerous overconfidence as they set foot on battlefields across Europe. They believed they were fighting a paper tiger, unaware that this paper tiger was about to roar. The German soldier, steeped in this ideology, was an efficient, disciplined, and often ruthless fighting machine. Their initial successes across Europe had reinforced the belief in their own invincibility and the inferiority of their enemies. They had witnessed the fall of France in mere weeks, pushed the British off the continent, and plunged deep into the Soviet Union. To them, the Americans were distant, isolated, and ultimately irrelevant. Their military experience was limited to brief, humiliating engagements against seemingly backward forces. The idea that a nation across the Atlantic, with its perceived lack of Volksgemeinschaft, the German people's community, could pose a serious threat was utterly beyond their comprehension. They dismissed reports of American industrial capacity as mere boastful lies. Their military intelligence, often skewed by political bias, fed into this delusion, underestimating everything from American aircraft production to their logistical capabilities. This intellectual arrogance, cultivated by years of Nazi indoctrination, would prove to be one of their greatest strategic blunders. For these men, the impending journey across the Atlantic would not just be a physical transport, but a brutal, psychological awakening. They were about to step through the looking glass and confront a reality far more terrifying than any battlefield. By late 1943 and into 1944, the tide of war had irrevocably turned. The once invincible Wehrmacht was reeling from defeats on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, and now in Italy and France. Thousands of German soldiers, once proud conquerors, now found themselves prisoners of war. But their journey was not to a nearby prison camp in Britain or France. For many, a far longer voyage awaited, across the very ocean their propaganda had dismissed as a barrier, to the heart of the enemy they had so scorned. Loaded onto vast Allied transport ships, often the same vessels that had carried American GIs and their supplies to Europe, these captured men were a stark picture of defeat. Their uniforms were ragged, their faces gaunt, etched with the trauma of battle and the bitter taste of surrender. They huddled together, exhausted and uncertain, wondering what fate awaited them in the hands of the decadent Americans. For men who had been taught that their nation was at war with a crumbling, desperate enemy, the sheer scale of the Allied shipping, the organized efficiency of their transport, must have already hinted at a power far greater than anything they had been led to believe. The very journey itself was a silent, undeniable contradiction to everything they had been told. The voyage across the Atlantic was a stark odyssey, a journey from one reality to a completely alien one. For weeks, sometimes over a month, these men were confined to the cramped, often unsanitary holds of ships, guarded by the very soldiers they had been trained to despise. The vastness of the ocean, the endless horizon, was a powerful symbol of their isolation and the sheer distance between their shattered homeland and their unknown future. Many had never left their villages or towns, let alone seen an ocean liner. They watched, perhaps through small portholes or during brief moments on deck, as the Allied convoys, often stretching for miles, sailed unimpeded across the seas, protected by destroyers and aircraft carriers. This visible display of naval and industrial might was a prelude to the even greater shock awaiting them. For years, they had been told that Germany was fighting a world on its last legs, struggling for survival. Yet here they were, aboard ships that spoke of an endless supply chain, crossing an ocean that seemed effortlessly controlled by their adversaries. Every wave that crashed against the hull, every distant plume of smoke from an escort ship was slowly beginning to chip away at the edifice of propaganda, preparing them for the profound disorientation that would seize them upon their first glimpse of the shores of the United States. As the transport ships finally docked on American shores, often in bustling ports like New York or Boston, the German prisoners experienced their first profound cultural shock. For years, their lives had been defined by scarcity, rationing, and the grim realities of total war. Germany, even in its most prosperous pre-war years, had never known the sheer scale of civilian abundance that was now laid bare before their eyes. The docks were a hive of activity, not just with military convoys, but with civilian trucks, cars, and trains moving goods with astonishing speed. Beyond the immediate port, the towering skyscrapers of American cities pierced the sky, a testament to an architectural and industrial prowess they had never truly believed existed. These were not the bomb-scarred, struggling cities depicted in Nazi newsreels. These were vibrant, thriving metropolises pulsating with energy. Many prisoners reportedly just stood in stunned silence, their jaws slack, unable to reconcile this image with the impoverished, chaotic America they had been taught to despise. The very air seemed to hum with an unsettling normalcy, a stark contrast to the constant tension and ever-present destruction they had left behind. The sheer number of civilian automobiles was often the first thing that struck them. In wartime Germany, gasoline was rationed to the absolute minimum, and civilian cars were a rare sight, symbols of a bygone era. Yet here, thousands of cars streamed along wide, clean highways, seemingly without a care for fuel shortages. The shops, even from a distance, appeared well-stocked, their windows displaying goods that Germans hadn't seen in years. Fresh fruits, textiles, luxury items, all readily available in a nation supposedly fighting for its very survival. This immediate visual evidence of a society that was not just surviving, but actively thriving amidst a global conflict, shattered decades of propaganda in a single disorienting moment. They saw well-fed civilians going about their daily lives, seemingly untouched by the war that was tearing Europe apart. It wasn't the image of a nation struggling for existence. It was the image of a boundless reservoir of wealth and resources. The first glimpse of America was not a battlefield, but a dazzling, almost overwhelming display of peacetime prosperity, paradoxically happening in the middle of the greatest war in history. For many, this single moment was the first undeniable crack in the carefully constructed facade of Nazi ideology. For a German soldier, the concept of luxury had vanished years ago, replaced by the bitter taste of ersatz coffee and sawdust-filled bread. So when the first rations of real chocolate, fresh oranges, and ice-cold Coca-Cola arrived in the POW camps, it felt like a hallucination. They sat in the dust of Texas or Kansas, holding glass bottles that were chilled, a feat of refrigeration they hadn't seen even in Berlin's finest hotels during the war. This wasn't just sugar and caffeine, it was a psychological operation without a single shot being fired. They realized that while their own families were starving in the ruins of the Ruhr, their captors had so much surplus that they could give the enemy luxuries that a German general couldn't obtain. The sight of a common American private casually eating a dish of vanilla ice cream in the middle of a summer afternoon was the moment many POWs realized the war was fundamentally over. You cannot defeat a nation that treats the production of ice cream with the same industrial seriousness as the production of artillery shells. The Coca-Cola shock ran deep into the German soul. Propaganda had painted Americans as a decadent, weak people who would crumble under the iron will of the Reich. Yet here was the evidence of a strength that was far more terrifying than any panzer division, the strength of absolute abundance. The prisoners wrote letters home describing the white bread that tasted like cake and the fact that they were gaining weight while in captivity. One prisoner famously remarked that if the American army had enough shipping space to send millions of glass bottles of soda across the Atlantic, they clearly had enough space to send whatever else they needed to win. This abundance broke the back of Nazi indoctrination. It proved that the American decadence was actually a byproduct of an industrial machine so powerful it didn't even have to try. The sweet taste of the soda was the bitter taste of a lost cause. It was the moment they understood that Germany had been fighting a titan with the resources of a toy shop. For the German soldier, the railway had always been the backbone of the war effort, but it was a backbone that was slowly being snapped by Allied bombers. In Europe, a supply train was a prime target, a fragile line of 30 cars moving through a landscape of ruined stations and sabotaged tracks. But as these POWs looked out from their transport cars, they saw the iron arteries of a continent that had never known a single air raid. They saw freight trains of impossible length, sometimes over 100 cars long, hauled by locomotives so massive they looked like prehistoric beasts made of iron and steam. They sat at crossings for what felt like an eternity, watching a single train carry more raw steel and heavy machinery than an entire German industrial district could produce in a month. This wasn't just transportation, it was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse of a nation that was moving its entire geography toward the front lines. The realization was staggering. For every mile they traveled into the American heartland, they saw more trains, more tracks, and more power. They were witnessing a logistics system that didn't just support the war, it overwhelmed it with the sheer weight of its existence. The psychological impact of these infinite trains was a turning point for the prisoners' morale. They began to do the math in their heads, a German habit that now brought them nothing but despair. They calculated the tonnage of food, fuel, and ammunition passing by their windows every hour. They realized that while their own divisions in Russia or France were sharing a handful of trucks and relying on horse-drawn wagons to move artillery, the Americans were moving entire industrial cities on wheels. There were no blown-out bridges here, no partisan ambushes, and no coal shortages. The trains moved with a terrifying clockwork precision, 24 hours a day, through a landscape that seemed to have no end. One captured engineer later remarked that he felt spiritually crushed by the sight of a single American freight yard. He realized that Germany wasn't just fighting an army of men, they were fighting a continental assembly line. The trains were the proof that the U-boat campaign had failed, not because they hadn't sunk ships, but because America's internal production and transport were so vast that the losses in the Atlantic were nothing more than a minor accounting error in the ledger of a titan. Since the first sirens wailed in 1939, Europe had become a continent of shadows. Every German citizen lived under the absolute discipline of the Verdunkelung, the total blackout. A single stray light from a window, a misplaced flashlight, or even the glow of a cigarette could draw a swarm of RAF bombers. But as the POW transport trains rolled through the American night, the German soldiers crowded the windows in a state of absolute, wide-eyed shock. Below them, the cities were erupting in a fountain of light. Thousands of street lamps, glowing theater marquees, and brilliantly lit skyscrapers defied the darkness. There were no blackout curtains. There were no searchlights scanning the sky for enemy wings. To the Germans, this was the ultimate, arrogant display of untouchable power. It meant that the United States was so secure behind its two-ocean moat that it didn't even bother to hide its cities. The Americans weren't just winning the war, they were conducting it while maintaining the luxuries of a world at peace. The psychological weight of seeing a lit-up Broadway or a glowing Midwestern factory district was more devastating than any artillery barrage they had faced in the hedgerows of Normandy. For men who had spent years huddled in bunkers or shivering in the dark ruins of the fatherland, these lit cities were a haunting vision of a future they could no longer claim. They watched as American civilians walked through brightly lit streets, entering restaurants and cinemas, completely unburdened by the fear of death from above. The prisoners realized that while Berlin and Hamburg were being methodically erased from the map, American cities were thriving, expanding, and glowing with an energy that felt infinite. Some of the hardcore Nazi officers tried to dismiss it as a trick, a Hollywood set built to deceive them. But as the hours turned into days and the lights never went out, the truth became inescapable. This was a nation that had so much electricity, so much coal, and so much confidence that it could afford to waste more light on a single amusement park than a German city used in an entire week. The cities of light represented a standard of living and a degree of safety that Germany could never hope to achieve, even in victory. The realization settled in their hearts like cold lead. You cannot defeat an enemy that doesn't even feel the need to turn out the lights when you are at war with them. In the Third Reich, the ideology of blood and soil had glorified the German peasant, yet the reality on the ground was often archaic. Even at the height of the war, much of German agriculture still relied on the muscle of horses and the manual labor of women and elderly men. But as the POWs were moved through the American Midwest, they saw a different kind of blood and soil, one that was fueled by gasoline and steel. They looked out onto fields of wheat and corn that seemed to span entire provinces, and across these fields moved fleets of modern tractors, harvesters, and mechanical sowers. This was industrialized farming on a scale that felt alien to the European mind. One German farmer turned soldier noted in his diary that he saw more tractors in a single afternoon in Kansas than existed in his entire home district in Bavaria. The Americans weren't just growing food, they were manufacturing it with the same efficiency they used to build bombers. This total mechanization meant that the American food supply was virtually immune to the labor shortages that were crippling the German home front. The prisoners realized that they were being fed by a nation that had solved the problem of hunger through the sheer power of the machine. The sight of the mechanized heartland brought a deep existential dread to the captured Germans. They had been told that Germany needed to conquer the East, the black soil of Ukraine, to ensure the survival of the master race. Yet here was a nation that already possessed that Lebensraum in abundance, and it was using technology to make every acre produce a mountain of grain. They saw silos the size of cathedrals and grain elevators that towered over the landscape like fortresses of plenty. They realized that while Germany was fighting a desperate war to secure a few more miles of dirt, the Americans were effortlessly feeding half the world. The abundance was so great that the POWs themselves were often fed better than the civilian population back in Germany. They were given fresh meat, white bread, and vegetables daily, rations that were unheard of in the Wehrmacht. This agricultural might was the foundation of the American war machine. A soldier who is well-fed, backed by a nation that has a surplus of everything, is a soldier who can stay in the fight forever. The tractors in the fields of Kansas were just as much a part of the Allied victory as the tanks in the streets of Paris. They were the engines of an invincible economy. For years, Nazi social policy had insisted that a woman's place was Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Germany had been slow and reluctant to fully mobilize its female population into the heavy industries of war, fearing it would undermine the social fabric of the Reich. But as the POWs were shown propaganda films or caught glimpses of American factories near the camps, they were shocked to see millions of American women, daughters, wives, and mothers filling the gaps left by the men at the front. They saw Rosie the Riveter not as a poster, but as a living, breathing industrial force. These women were welding hulls, riveting wings, and assembling complex engines with a speed and precision that matched any master craftsman in Essen. The prisoners realized that they weren't just fighting the American military, they were fighting the entire American family. The total mobilization of the female workforce meant that America's industrial output hadn't just remained stable, it had doubled and tripled while its men were overseas. This was a degree of social and industrial flexibility that the rigid Nazi system could never replicate, and it meant that the American war machine had a depth of manpower and woman power that was simply inexhaustible. The sight of women building the very planes that were currently leveling German cities was a profound blow to the prisoners' sense of superiority. They saw the weaker sex handling heavy machinery and managing complex logistics with an ease that shattered their ideological training. In America, the factory had become the new front line, and every citizen was a combatant in the war of production. The POWs realized that for every German soldier who fell, there was an American woman in a factory in Michigan or California ensuring that 10 more tanks would take his place. This wasn't just a military conflict, it was an industrial crusade. The efficiency of these women, working in 3 shifts around the clock, created a conveyor belt of destruction that Germany could not stop. The prisoners began to understand that the American home front was a furnace of production that never cooled. While Germany was struggling to find enough slave labor to keep its factories running under the threat of air raids, the American people had voluntarily transformed their entire society into a unified engine of war. The hammer of Rosie was just as lethal as the bayonet of the GI, and it was a hammer that was currently forging the chains of Germany's defeat. German engineering had always prided itself on craftsmanship and the Meister tradition, the creation of high-quality, specialized machines. But this focus on perfection had a fatal flaw in a total war: lack of standardization. Every Tiger tank was practically a hand-built work of art, with parts that often didn't fit the next tank on the line. When a German tank broke down, it required a specialist and a specific part that might be hundreds of miles away. But as the POWs worked in American depots or saw the equipment of their guards, they were introduced to the American cult of interchangeability. They saw thousands of jeeps, trucks, and tanks where every single bolt, screw, and engine component was identical. They watched as American mechanics would cannibalize parts from 3 wrecked vehicles to create a working one in a matter of hours. This was the victory of the identical screw. The Americans had sacrificed the art of engineering for the science of mass production. To the German technical mind, it was a brutal, efficient revelation. They realized that the Americans weren't just making weapons, they were making disposable weapons that could be repaired anywhere in the world with a standard wrench. This standardization allowed the Americans to achieve a scale of maintenance and repair that the Germans couldn't even imagine. The POWs saw warehouses the size of airfields filled with standardized parts, all cataloged and ready for shipment to any corner of the globe. They realized that an American Sherman tank might not be as individually powerful as a German Panther, but the Sherman would always have a spare engine, a spare track, and a mechanic who knew exactly how to fix it, because every Sherman was the same. The German army was a collection of high-tech prototypes. The American army was a mass-produced machine. This industrial philosophy extended to everything, from the K-rations they ate to the uniforms they wore. Everything was standard issue. This uniformity created a logistical fluidity that allowed the Allies to stay on the offensive. The prisoners understood then that they were being defeated by the assembly line. The Americans had industrialized the very concept of repair and replacement. For a German soldier who had seen his unit paralyzed for weeks because of a single broken transmission, the sight of 1,000 identical, ready-to-use American engines was the ultimate proof that their war of craftsmanship had lost to the war of the factory. In Germany, the industrial heart was beating irregularly. Allied air raids meant that production was often halted for hours or days. Factories were being moved into damp salt mines or hidden in forests, disrupting the flow of labor and materials. But as the POWs looked out at the American landscape, they saw the terrifying spectacle of the three shifts. American industry never slept. They saw factories that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no interruptions. As the sun went down, the floodlights came on, and the next army of workers marched into the gates. There was no closing time in the arsenal of democracy. This relentless, non-stop production cycle created a momentum that was impossible to break. The prisoners realized that for every hour they spent sleeping in their barracks, the Americans had produced another dozen aircraft and another 100 tons of shells. The three shifts were a physical manifestation of a nation that had committed every second of its existence to the destruction of the Axis. It was a cold, mechanical reality that made the German struggle feel small and futile. The sheer volume of production achieved by this round-the-clock labor was beyond anything the German High Command had predicted. The POWs heard stories and saw the evidence of Liberty ships being built in a matter of days and B-24 bombers rolling off the line at a rate of 1 per hour. They saw car parks near the factories filled with thousands of workers' automobiles. Another shock, as most German workers couldn't even afford a bicycle. This was a prosperous, motivated, and safe workforce that was crushing the Reich from 4,000 miles away. The prisoners began to understand the industrial overmatch. It didn't matter how well a German soldier fought on the front line if the American factory was producing weapons faster than the German army could destroy them. The three shifts were the heartbeat of an inevitable victory. Every hammer blow in a shipyard in California was a death knell for a battalion in Russia. The war was being won not by tactical brilliance, but by the relentless, unceasing passage of time in the American factory, where the lights never flickered and the assembly line never stopped. To a German soldier raised in the rigid, hyper-disciplined atmosphere of the Wehrmacht, the American soldier was a walking contradiction. The Americans seemed to have no military bearing in the traditional Prussian sense. They chewed gum, they kept their hands in their pockets, and they spoke to their officers with a casualness that would have resulted in a court-martial in the German army. But as the POWs observed their guards, they realized that this lack of formality didn't mean a lack of discipline, it meant a different kind of efficiency. The Americans were motivated not by fear of their superiors, but by a strange, individualistic confidence. They listened to jazz, music that had been condemned as degenerate in the Reich, and they seemed to possess a vibrant, restless energy. This was the jazz of democracy. It was a culture that valued initiative and comfort over ritual and fear. The POWs saw that even in a war zone, the Americans prioritized the morale of the individual, providing them with movies, music, and a sense of humor that the grim Nazi ideology could never allow. It was a cultural shock that forced the prisoners to question the very nature of the master race they were supposed to represent. The American guards often treated the prisoners with a baffling mixture of indifference and casual kindness. They would share cigarettes, talk about their families in Brooklyn or Ohio, and play baseball within sight of the barracks. This soft power was incredibly effective. The prisoners realized that the Americans weren't the monsters or weaklings they had been told about. They were a people who genuinely believed in their own way of life, and that belief was reflected in the casual ease with which they conducted themselves. The jazz music that drifted through the camps became the soundtrack of their captivity, a rhythmic, improvised sound that represented a world of freedom and choice. This cultural exposure acted as a silent form of denazification. You cannot sustain a hatred for a people who are so much like yourself, yet so much more relaxed and prosperous. The prisoners began to see that the master race was actually a prison of the mind, while the American decadence was actually the ultimate strength. The jazz of democracy was the sound of a world that was moving on without them, and many POWs secretly began to hope that they could one day be a part of it. The Germans had invented the Autobahn, and they were proud of it as a symbol of Nazi progress. But in America, the prisoners saw a network of roads and highways that turned the entire continent into a single high-speed theater of war. They were transported through the vast deserts of the Southwest and the mountains of the West, and everywhere they went, they saw wide, paved roads that allowed for the rapid movement of troops and materiel. In Russia, the German army had been defeated as much by the mud and the lack of roads as by the Red Army. Here, the mud had been conquered by concrete. They saw convoys of thousands of trucks moving at 60 miles per hour day and night, connecting the raw materials of the mines with the factories of the East and the ports of the West. This was continental speed. The Americans had mastered the tyranny of distance through an infrastructure that made the German Autobahn look like a localized experiment. Every road was a weapon, and every truck was a delivery system for the inevitable defeat of the Axis. The scale of the American road network allowed for a logistical flexibility that the Germans simply couldn't match. They watched as thousands of tons of supplies were moved effortlessly across distances that would have spanned multiple European countries. This geographic mobility meant that the Americans could concentrate their power wherever and whenever they chose. The POWs realized that the American hinterland was not just a place where things were made, but a place that was perfectly connected to the front lines. The speed of the American convoy was the speed of the war. While the German army was often stationary, waiting for fuel or parts, the American army was always in motion. The prisoners felt the vastness of the American landscape not as a barrier, but as a source of strength. They understood that you cannot defeat an enemy that has so much space and so much speed. The desert highways were the arteries of an empire that was too big to be strangled and too fast to be caught. For the men in the transport cars, the long, straight line of the American road was the final proof that their tactical victories in Europe were meaningless against the strategic momentum of a continent in motion. The most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal wasn't a bomb, it was a letter. The POWs were allowed to write home, and as they sat in their clean, well-fed camps in America, their letters began to carry a devastating truth back to the ruins of Germany. They wrote to their wives in Berlin and their mothers in Munich, trying to describe a world that sounded like a fairy tale. They wrote about the white bread, the oranges, the endless trains, and the cities of light. They told their families, "Do not worry about me. I am fed better than a king." These letters bypassed the official propaganda of the Reich. When a starving mother in a basement in Hamburg read about her son eating steak and chocolate in Texas, the last remnants of her faith in Hitler's final victory vanished. The truth of American abundance acted like a slow-acting poison on the morale of the German home front. It proved that the enemy was not the starving, bankrupt mob that Goebbels had described, but a titan of limitless wealth. Every letter sent from an American camp was a blow to the German will to fight. The censorship of these letters was a desperate and futile effort by the Nazi authorities. They tried to block descriptions of American prosperity, but the truth was too big to hide. The POWs were the only Germans who actually knew the truth about the enemy, and their testimony was undeniable. They spoke of the kindness of their captors and the sheer scale of the American industrial machine. This reverse propaganda was incredibly effective. It created a sense of despair among the German civilian population, who realized that they were being sacrificed for a cause that was already lost. The prisoners themselves began to feel a sense of guilt, a survivor's guilt, knowing they were living in luxury while their loved ones were being buried under Allied bombs. This emotional conflict further eroded their loyalty to the Nazi regime. They realized that the master race was actually the one being fed by the inferior Americans. The letters of truth were the final bridge between the two worlds, and they ensured that when the war finally ended, the German people were already psychologically prepared for the American occupation. The pen of the prisoner had finished what the sword of the soldier had started. For years, the German military had comforted itself with the myth of Deutsche Wertarbeit, German technical superiority. They believed that while the Americans had more, the Germans had better. They pointed to their V rockets, their jet fighters, and their heavy tanks as proof of their genius. But as the POWs, especially the technicians and engineers, encountered American technology in the camps, that myth began to crumble. They saw American radar units that were smaller and more reliable than anything they had. They saw advanced radio equipment, sophisticated optical sights, and the early use of electronic computers for logistics. They realized that the Americans hadn't just mastered mass production, they had mastered the application of science to the battlefield. The Americans didn't build a few wonder weapons, they built 1,000,000 effective weapons. This shift from quality of the few to quality of the many was a technological revolution that the Germans had completely missed. The prisoners understood that the war had been won by the side that could turn a laboratory experiment into 1,000,000 shelf-stable products in 6 months. The shock of American technical proficiency went beyond the big machines. The prisoners were amazed by the small things, the reliability of an American truck's engine, the waterproof packaging of their rations, and the sheer quality of their medical equipment. They saw that the Americans had treated war as a massive engineering problem to be solved with logic and resources. They realized that the German obsession with genius and will had been no match for the American obsession with data and systems. The end of technical superiority was a humbling experience for the German elite. They saw that the Americans had industrialized the very process of innovation. One captured physicist remarked that the Americans were scientific barbarians. They didn't care about the beauty of the theory, they only cared if the machine worked every single time. This pragmatic approach to technology was the final nail in the coffin of the Reich. It proved that the Americans had not just outproduced Germany, but they had outthought them in the only way that mattered, in the practical, brutal application of science to the destruction of the enemy. The myth of the superior German mind was dead, buried under a mountain of standardized, high-tech American steel. As the gates of the POW camps finally opened in late 1945 and 1946, the millions of German men returning to their shattered homeland carried with them a secret that would change the course of history. They were not returning as the same soldiers who had marched into Poland or Russia. They were returning as men who had seen the future. They had lived for years in the heart of the American Empire, and they had seen what a nation could achieve when its energy was directed toward production, prosperity, and individual freedom. They returned to a Germany of ruins, of hunger, and of shame, but they brought with them a blueprint for a new world. They had seen the white bread, the infinite trains, and the cities of light, and they knew that the old ways of European militarism were not just evil, they were obsolete. These former prisoners would become the silent architects of the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. They would take the lessons of American efficiency, standardization, and industrial management and apply them to the reconstruction of their own country. The shock they felt in 1944 became the inspiration for the Germany of 1950. The story of the German POWs in America is the story of a silent conquest of the mind. The war was won on the battlefields, but the peace was won in the mess halls and on the transport trains of the American Midwest. These men had seen the arsenal of democracy and realized it was actually the engine of progress. They had seen that the American dream was built on the ability to produce for the many rather than the few. As they stepped off the ships into the rubble of Bremerhaven or Hamburg, they carried the memory of the endless horizons and the unlit cities. They understood that Germany's only path forward was to stop building fortresses and start building factories, not for war, but for the world. The legacy of the mulberry harbors, the whale roads, and the phoenix caissons lived on in the minds of these men. They had seen the power of the logistical mind, and they chose to embrace it. The final image of the war for them was not a swastika in the dust, but a glowing neon sign in a land of plenty, a sign that said the future belonged to those who could build a bridge to tomorrow. The war was over. The miracle was about to begin, and the world would never be the same again.